I've talked before about how using convertible securities as a funding approach is something that can sneak up on you when it comes to the dilution impact when you do a priced round and suddenly there's a lot more dilution there than you thought you'd have. Today we'll walk through a post-money safe spreadsheet so that you can analyze up to 5 different post-money safe investments to see what the impact will be on the founder share dilution. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and I use this Startup SOS channel to provide practical how-to advice for first-time entrepreneurs. So today it's the post-money safe, a spreadsheet for analyzing your dilution. We'll use as our example the example they use in Appendix 2 of Y-Combinator's Quick Start Guide for the SAFE. There's a link in the notes where you can download that document so you can follow through and actually experiment with those numbers that you see in the example in the actual spreadsheet. And of course, there's a link in the notes to download the spreadsheet as well so you can plug in your own numbers. Now, we've talked before about how there are many ways to convert convertible securities into stock, some more favorable to founders and some less favorable. Here are the key assumptions that underlie the approach taken by Y-Combinator in their Quick Start example. First of all, they assume there'll be a fixed number of unallocated options at the end of the round. And in particular, they assume that's 10% of the company. They also assume that at the end of the round, the Series A investors, which includes the pro rata investment from that any of the SAFE investors might have, that is a fixed percent of the ownership. And again, in the example, it's 25%. So they're going to kind of mark up the Series A shares to get to that 25%, so they're not diluted by the investment from all of those safes that are converted into stock. And finally, the post-money safe round is actually getting diluted by those new options that are being issued as a part of this round that are going to net out to 10% of the company at the end of the round. Now, one of the investors in the example, one of the SAFE investors, has a pro rata right, which means they have the right to buy additional shares, presumably to maintain their investment percentage. Now, the investment percent they had in the SAFE round was 10%, so they get to invest more. However, although they get the right to buy 10% of the Series A round, the assumption built into Y-Combinator's model is that all of those options that get issued do dilute the SAFE round, the stock that they bought during the SAFE round. So by the end of it, that particular SAFE investor does not own 10% of the company. They own just over 9% of the company because, again, the stock they got as part of the SAFE round gets diluted by the option pool. Let's start with the pre-investment cap table for the company. We're assuming that the founders have about 9.25 million shares of stock. There's 650,000 shares in an option pool that's committed for a total of 9.9 million, and another 100,000 shares allocated for options that are not yet committed to anyone. So that's a total of 10 million shares of stock before any investment occurs. So do the math, and the founders own a little more than 93% of the shares before the investment round if you just look at the actual issued shares. But if you take into account the fully diluted shares, i.e. the 100,000 shares that were issued or at least allocated but not issued, not committed yet, then they have about 92.5% of the company. And then, of course, they take on some safe investment. In this example, again, the example that's covered in Y-Combinator's Quick Start Guide, there are 2 investments from 2 post-money safe investors. The first invests $200,000 with a post-money cap of $4 million. The second invests $800,000 with a post-money cap of $8 million. We're assuming that there aren't any discounts that come into play here, and so bottom line, the first investor is going to, at the end of the SAFE round, own 5% of the company, and the second investor will own 10%. And we further assume that the second investor, the larger investor, is given a pro rata right, which means then in the Series A round, they have the right to purchase additional shares to maintain their percentage ownership. And then they get an offer for a Series A investment. So the assumptions behind that are $15 million pre-money value, a $5 million investment, and the investor C, which would be the lead investor, is investing $4 million of that. The rest of the investment will be from other investors, and of course the pro rata investment from that one safe investor with a pro rata right. They're also requiring, as I mentioned before, that 10% of the company's shares be allocated to an uncommitted stock option pool. Now, the implication is, if you look at their investment of $5 million total and the pre-money of 15, so the post-money value is going to be $20 million. $5 million is 25% of that. So what they're requiring is that at the end of the round, the Series A investors are going to still own 25% of the company, even though there's all that safe money that also is going to convert to stock. How do we figure out what the end of the round looks like? Well, first of all, we're going to start with the safe round, treating the safe itself as its own separate round. So to figure out what the safe round looks like, the challenge is we have to figure out what the price is going to be for the stock in the Series A. The reason is that until we do that, we don't know whether it's a better deal for each safe investor to get the price implied by their post-money cap, or should they get the price implied by the Series A. If the Series A deal is a better deal, they'll get that price. So to be sure, you have to calculate that and then decide the price, and then you'll know how much stock each safe investor gets. So how do we do that? Well, we talked in the last video about the challenge being that this is an iterative process, because the price determines the total number of shares, and the total number of shares determines the price. It's circular. So the challenge is you get to iterate to figure out what that is. Now, where do you start? Well, our starting point here is $1.275 per share. Where'd that come from? Well, we get there by assuming that the post-money cap is the thing that will determine the best price. May or may not be true, but it'll at least be close. Then we can actually calculate what the total number of shares is and come up with a share price. We simply look at what percent of the company the safe investors get, compare that to the total number of shares that we begin with from the founders and the option pool, and you look at how many additional shares you'll have to issue then for the safe investors to get the percentage that they've been promised. So for example, like in this case, the safe investors have been promised a total of 15% of the company. Well, you take the total number of shares owned by the founders and already allocated for options, and you divide 1 minus 0.15 into that to determine the total number of shares that you have to make room for that 15% for the safe investments. So that gives you a pretty good estimate of the total number of shares, and you simply take your pre-money value, divide those shares into it, and that gives you a $1 per share number that's going to be close, but it's going to be too high. Because you know that more shares will be issued. You've got options to issue, you've got shares to be issued for the Series A investors. So you know there'll be more shares, and hence the price is going to be lower. But this gives you a good starting point. What the spreadsheet has, just like the spreadsheet we went over in the last video, is a place where you can enter your guess, your iterated guess at a price. And the spreadsheet shows you what the implication is then for the percent ownership of the Series A investors. As you can see, when you plug in the $1.275 price, the Series A ownership is lower than it needs to be. It needs to be 25%, and it's less than that. So you know that you have to have a lower price. Now, if you tweak and experiment, slowly lower the price, what you'll find is $1.1144 gives you, at least out to 4 digits of accuracy, the right 25% for the Series A investors. Now that we have the price, we can figure out the right number of shares for the safe investors. We start by simply looking at how much they would get, assuming that they get their percent guaranteed in the safe. So we use that totally diluted number of shares, apply their percentage to it, and these are the numbers we come up to. 580,000 for the A investor and twice that for the B investor. Given that, and given how much they've invested, we can do that division and figure out the share price that they would be paying in that scenario. So that's about 34 cents and 68 cents respectively. Now, in both cases, that's a better deal than the Series A price, which is over $1. So that will be what they pay, the SAFE price, not the Series A price. There's a couple more columns there. You can see it talks about the shares converted in the Series A price. Well, in this scenario, no shares are converted in the Series A price, so those are all zero. Next column talks about what percent of those that do convert to stock will be converting at the SAFE price. And then there's a total there at the bottom showing it's a total of 15%. So why do we have the last two columns there? They seem pretty boring. Well, those are there for the scenario that some of the SAFE investors might be better off in paying the Series A price instead of paying the price that they get from their post-money cap. There is, in fact, in the Y-Combinator write-up, a second scenario where exactly that happens. The pre-money, instead of being 15 million, is 11 million. And in that scenario, the SAFE B investor is actually better off going with the Series A price. They get more stock that way, so that's what they'll do. So the way the spreadsheet works is those investors that are getting Series A pricing are listed in that second to the last column. And those that are getting the SAFE pricing, their percentage is shown in the last column. So to figure out the fully diluted number of shares in the Series A round, what we can do then is take the Series A price, figure out how much stock goes to the Series A. That's easy, the price divided into how much they're investing. Figure out how many shares will go to those SAFE investors who are paying the Series A price. Well, we know how much they paid. We know the Series A price, so we can figure out their amount of stock. Now we have the total capitalization except for the 10% for the option pool and however many percent from the last column that we have to allocate to the SAFE investors. Let's say it was 10% for the option pool and maybe 5% for the investors that actually paid the SAFE price instead of the Series A price. So we take all of that other stock, divide 1 minus that percent, and then we have the total capitalization for the company. Kind of a roundabout way, but that gets you to the right number, even if some of your SAFE investors are paying the Series A price instead of paying their SAFE price. So again, if you plug in the numbers for that second example, Y-Combinator goes over in terms of the $11 million pre-money, you'll see how that gets reflected in this part of the spreadsheet and how that affects the next table, which shows the actual number of shares. And here it is. So again, the founders have their 9.25 million shares. We calculated the amount of stock that goes to the SAFE investors, and we know how much stock was in the option pool. So we can see that now our founders have about 78% of the company. And that's just after the SAFE round, after all of those SAFE dollars convert to stock. Now we're set to do the actual investment of the Series A. So here are all the calculations that were behind that earlier point in the spreadsheet where you were iterating the price and it was estimating the percent of the Series A. Given the Series A price that you plugged in, it calculates the total number of shares that are going to the Series A. Then it calculates the pro rata for any of the SAFE investors who get a pro rata right. In this example, that was just the B investor. They got 10%, and so their pro rata right is 10% of that Series A number. Going down the list, there were no other pro rata rights, so that means there's just barely over 4 million shares available for the other Series A investors. In other words, the original number, 4.486 million, minus what had to be allocated for the pro rata. Adding all of that up, the total number of shares that we've taken into account so far is just over 16 million. So now the question is, how many options do we have to issue so that there are a total of 10% of the total capitalization of the company in the option pool? Well, Again, we've done this calculation before. The number is 10%, so you take 1 minus that 10%, or 0.9, and divide that into 16.1 million. Subtract out the 16.1 number, and 100,000 shares of uncommitted options. Keep in mind that there were already 100,000 shares of uncommitted options available. That tells you how many new options you'll have to issue. After issuing those 1.69 million new shares, there'll be more like 1.79 million shares actually available for the option pool. And that finally gets us to our fully diluted number after the Series A of just over 17.9 million shares. So here is what our cap table looks like after the round is all done. Again, we talked about how many shares the founders have. We calculated the shares that go to the SAFE investors. Note that for the B SAFE investor, that includes their base shares from the SAFE round plus their pro rata number of shares. And then the shares for the Series A big investor that did 4 million, and the other Series A investors that invested the number that was remaining. And again, we've got the 650K options there. So what does that mean for our founders? Well, they end up with about 57% of the company if you look at just the total committed outstanding shares. But if you look at the fully diluted number, in other words, you add in all of those options that are now available, and their ownership goes down to 51.54%. So even though you did a Series A round where the initial numbers were that the investor was going to own 25% of the company after the round, given the pre-money value, how much money they put in, and the post-money, you obviously sold a lot more than 25% of the company. The founders now really only have 51%. And that's a good example of how all of that convertible security money can creep up on you and cause quite a bit more dilution. Really about double the dilution that would have resulted from just the original Series A investment without the safes involved. Now, one other thing worth mentioning, if you're comparing the spreadsheet numbers to the write-up from Y-Combinator in their quick start guide, I'm showing here 1.794 million shares in the option pool, and their numbers show 1.795. They've rounded it up about 400 shares. We're in agreement out to 4 decimal places. I think we can write that off to a rounding error. Why they rounded it up, I'm not sure, but I think this is probably close enough. And if anybody is aware of why there's a discrepancy there, why Y-Combinator used the 1.795, I'd love to hear it. But I do believe that the calculations in this spreadsheet are correct, at least until somebody points out otherwise. So that's it. Fully diluted 17.946 million shares, and our founders are down to 51.54%. And you now, of course, can download the spreadsheet and experiment with up to 5 different post-money safes and see what impact they might have on your dilution. That's it for our discussion of the post-money safe share dilution spreadsheet. I hope this was useful. Hope you find the spreadsheet to be useful. And if it was useful, please click the like, share, comment, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and click on the bell so you'll get notified when we have new videos, because there are always more coming up. One that we'll have coming up is yet another spreadsheet where you can analyze a combination of convertible notes, pre-money safes, and post-money safes, since that certainly happens in the real world where you get a mixture of different instruments, because different investors actually have different preferences as to what type of investment they'd like to make. Be sure and stay tuned for that. All of these videos on dilution spreadsheets will be going into a playlist. There's a link to that right below me, so you can keep up with the entire thing. That's it for now. Thank you very much for watching.